So all this software
Very good evening, doctors. I am Pratik from Harmonica Acumentis from Mumbai Head Office Marketing Team. So today I would like to welcome you all on behalf of our Harmonica Acumentis division for this wonderful program that we have planned on the endometriosis as well as the fibroids. So it's after a long time we are doing a physical meeting in the Goa and everyone is excited. It's so good to see you all. And for further proceeding, I would like to hand over Dr. Sailesh.
Very good evening and warm welcome to you all. Special welcome to our guest speaker of the day, Dr. Pratap Kumar, who has come all the way to enlighten us on newer perspectives in endometriosis. And big thanks to all of you for being in time. In spite of persistent requests on WhatsApp group, I'm not happy with the crowd because for today's meeting we have 51 registrations. So and I actually put in the I announced on the group whether anybody would like to withdraw because of last minute hitches, but nobody has withdrawn. So that means at least we expect 45 to 50 people here today, out of which around 20 are here already. I'm thankful to you. Actually, I'm speaking to a wrong crowd about importance of punctuality. I know, but somehow I have to vent. Being president, I have to vent myself out. So yeah, and I heard that there are traffic jams. But then we should know by now, being in Goa, that there will be traffic jams. I knew that there is going to be traffic jam on Kortaling Bridge. I started 40 minutes advance. Dr. Pratap Kumar is not from Goa. He started 1 hour early from Margao. So I think we should find ways out. Senior Dr. Anjali Kamath reached here before me. 7:25 she was here. So if there is a will, there will be way. Basically, I want these programs, the CME programs, to be fruitful. We should have proper interaction. And interaction, when I say interaction, there should be more discussions. Now what will happen is, suppose we start programs late, we announce it at 7:30 and start by 8:30, 9. By the time Dr. Pratap Kumar speaks, 9:30. By the time 10:15, everybody starts seeing their watch, and then panel discussion, somehow it winds up. And then some people have their questions to ask, queries to ask, but then they say some nice smell coming that side. Somehow that does not materialize. So the purpose is not solved. I think we should have enough time at the end to feel, okay, I have a question, let me ask it. There should be a proper interaction. Then only we can call these meetings fruitful. If you want to have that, then we should start in time. So we can have proper discussions. Everybody, all of us are practicing gynecologists. We have our own opinions maybe about fibroid, endometriosis. We can voice them out. Personally, Dr. Pratap Kumar is around. So, we'll get feedback. We may be wrong, but then unless we speak out, we will not know. So for that reason, we need to have interaction. And for that, I want to start meetings in time. I'm just repeating this because I want you all to go and pass on this message to your friends so that, someday at least, maybe at the end of my tenure, at least we start having meetings in time. We say 7:30, we should be able to start by 7:30.
It has not happened for 10 years and it will not happen, Shailesh.
Be positive, madam.
Madam, I had a very contrary experience.
We start all our Rotary meetings on time, even if there is no crowd.
I know that.
And then people come because of that.
I'm a Gurgaon president.
I am seeing since 2011.
Yeah, madam.
I am seeing since 84.
No, this is just beginning, and I'm sure it will happen. It will happen, and there are various means to do it. I don't want to go harsh way. That's why I'm just requesting people first. But slowly, yes, maybe it will come to that, and we will start in time. Be sure. Be sure. We will start in time before I.
Shailesh, one suggestion I am making.
Pardon?
You should have dinner at 7:30.
Start with dinner.
Yes, that's a very good suggestion.
No dinner after meeting.
All those options are there, but then we have 51 registration and 25 people attending the lecture. So that also I don't want to happen. Okay. So this is our second physical meeting. We started with a physical meeting once we took over in April, but then we had to go online for because of COVID problems. I'm very thankful to the young brigade, senior brigade, whoever took part in this online CMEs. We had a fantastic response, and we had every month we had a CME of each of 2.5 hours durations. It was possible only because of your cooperation. At least registrations and online this thing was there. I don't know. I mean, we were physically present there, but I'm thankful for, especially to the faculty. Many of you are here today. Okay, there are some administrative issues which we will be discussing after. Come, Bobby. There are some administrative issues to be discussed, which we will discuss after the panel discussion, before dinner. And prior to that, now coming back to the CME, I would request Dr. Ankita to welcome Dr. Pratap Kumar with a bouquet. I don't think Dr. Pratap Kumar needs any introduction to this crowd. He has been from multiple times. I'll just scroll through his CV. His CV is a lecture by itself, sir, so excuse me, I will just go through in brief. Sir is Professor and Head Department of Reproductive Medicine and Surgery at Kasturba Medical College Hospital, Manipal. He has been ex-chairman Foxy Imaging Science Committee 1991 to 95. Was president of Manipal branch of Foxy and vice president of Foxy for 1999. President-elect Karnataka State Obstetric Gynecology Association for 2011 and 12. Multiple awards and honors to sir's credit. Just enumerate a few. 1991 was awarded Young Gynecologist Award by Asia Oceania Federation of Obstetrics and Gynecology. 1996 Foxy Korean Award for Best Scientific Research in Obstetrics and Gynecology. 1997 sir was appointed by FIGO to be a member of the FIGO Expert Advisory Panel on ultrasound from 1997 to 2000. Was appointed by FIGO again in 2004 to be a member of the FIGO Advisory Panel. Sir was awarded Foxy Dr. Kutti Lifetime Achievement Award for 2011-12. Sir has received the Indian Society of Assisted Reproduction Drisha Lifetime Achievement Award for the year 2017. Received Ferti Vision 2018 Leading Lights in the field of reproductive medicine for the year 2018 by Indian Fertility Society. Received Champion of ICR Award from Indian Society of Assisted Reproduction at Hyderabad during Silver Jubilee Annual ISAR Conference. Sir has received recently the Teachers' Day Award by the Federation of Obstetrics and Gynecology Society, that is our Foxy and ICOG, for the diligent work and devotion in teaching and spreading knowledge, making the impact on clinical practice that brings Sir here today for the same purpose. Sir is on board of examiner for MBBS, DJO, MD for several universities in India and Malaysia. Sir has contributed various chapters in books and publications, various membership to Sir's credit. For me, I heard Sir speaking on topics as simple as labor, process of labor, to nuances in implantation in IVF, and trust me, all have been with a clear message and have been clear cut and well elucidated topics. So presenting to you, teacher of teachers, Dr. Pratap Kumar.
It's a pleasure to come to Goa once again, and when I was invited, I said, why not? I've also not been traveling for the last 1 year, 8 months. I started last week with a local nearby society. Then yesterday I had a talk at from Madgaon Society, and today I'm with you all. So I will be taking to you a little bit about 15 minutes only, the talk on adding pieces to puzzle in endometriosis. And as you know, over the years, it's the most confusing topic by itself. I think it works in between. Okay, I bring greetings from Manipal University. That is a university building with 4 floors of library for students and 4 floors of administrative building. Now, we know that in endometriosis, they come with infertility because it's been known for several years. A lot of additions, there are laparoscopic surgeons here. We get a tough surgery because everything is so stuck and we also know there's chronic inflammation impairing the function of all these genital areas, and of course they don't ovulate well, and even if they ovulate and they become pregnant, there is not a good pregnancy. So endometriosis, I think, is a problem by itself. Now, I'm not going to talk about this. Every postgraduate would know about the old theories, retrograde menstruation. We've been talking that forever. But I'm going to tell you what's the new thought of endometriosis other than what we knew before. We have realized endometriosis, endometrioma, we know it's blood, and blood contains heme. So what happens in the body is the iron sequestrated by the macrophages as ferritin. So these macrophages actually eat up that ferritin and then they become swollen up. So when they become swollen up, they are overloaded with iron. And during its attempt to destroy iron, it produces large amount of superoxide ion itself. That means there is a lot of oxidative stress on a oocyte, hence that is why they do not produce well. One of the potential pro-oxidant is iron-inducing oxidative stress. Now interestingly, this has been again kind of pushed aside, oxidative stress and so on. But what is happening recently, they realized that there are some free radicals in infertility which causes additions, causes toxicity to the sperm, causes arrest of fertilization, and the egg itself does not produce. So we have realized now that old theories are becoming older. But presently, what are we thinking about? They're connecting it to the newborn bleed. We find after delivery, girl babies have little bleed sometimes, and we'll say because of that maternal, removal of that hormones, she bleeds. But I think now the thinking is that mother should be told that little newborn may get endometriosis later. When she gets a menarche, she'll have severe dysmenorrhea. So when you find that history is there, that mother should be told that this is one of the thought. In endometriosis, anything can be a thought. So they identified peritoneal reflex from neonatal uterine bleeding occurring about 5% of newborns as a biologically plausible and likely cause of early endometriosis. That is interesting. So what they found is, because the cervix is very long in the newborn, not like the 2.5 centimeters, it occupies 3/4 of the uterus. Uterus is very small. When they bleed, most of it goes backwards. It doesn't go out. That's why the retrograde menstruation starts at that time there. And you realize that it goes to the peritoneal cavity and gets stuck on the peritoneum and remains dormant for several years. So the stem cell theory has come up now. All those cells which are stuck in the little bit of peritoneal niches, it's called niches, might get exacerbated in the subsequent menarche and the post-menarche time. So that's what's happening. I think the next picture shows you, this is the one. It gets stuck there, it's called as the putative stromal cells and the endometrial cells undergo dysfunctional, the glands, basalis, myometrium. Somewhere there, this is called niches. The endometrial basalis contains a small population of epithelial stem cells and stromal stem cells within the so-called endometrial niches. It remains like that for ages. I think this is very interesting data, and all mothers must be told that when their daughter gets severe dysmenorrhea later, it may be endometriosis. Long back, I attended one, I think one of the conference in Hong Kong. The plenary session was started by a patient. She suffered for 7 long years she's brilliant, she's a scholar in speeches. So she came as a plenary session #1 speaker, and I was amazed because she said 7 years they didn't diagnose. She had so much of endometriosis, pain. Ultrasound did not pick up any endometriosis, and that time we were not thinking why it should be there. I think now the present thinking is, and then she had so many surgeries, and finally she got a baby. So the whole 45 minutes was only on her experience, and she said how her pain became so much of, now it's connected to CNS also, the pain. The endometriotic pain is a central nervous system also is connected. So the pain threshold is very, very low. Even if you touch them, it is pain. So the threshold is so low in a woman's endometriosis, all because that pain sensitivity goes up. So minimum pain will be like a maximum symptom in her. That is why we should treat endometriosis even if you don't find endometriosis. It may be a little small thing stuck somewhere. You can give medical management for sure. That's the only condition where you don't have to prove the diagnosis. You give, so the diagnosis can be given even without diagnosis of endometriosis. That's what we think. Because then dysmenorrhea goes away. So do stem progenitor cells play a role in endometriosis? I think the answer is yes. Now, multipotent, self-renewing adult stromal cells that reside in both these little areas can flare up. They can remain dormant for several number of years until they kind of are stimulated by the estrogen. But what we have also found is endometriosis is estrogen dependent, everybody knows that, but there is also progesterone resistant. That is why there is no fantastic effective medicine. But now we know that for lifelong she'll have endometriosis, so we keep giving Namedin, something like that. So that is a progesterone resistance has come up now. That is why it is not very effective. So you should use the best of the drug. And now the choice, of course, you all know. We'll discuss in the panel discussion. So now, interestingly, progesterone resistance, why has it been a term resistance come up? Somewhat theories have, not theory, a lot of literature has come up on that. I'm going to share that with you, which I read recently. Now, this Human Genome Project, it doesn't enter our brains at all because we think it is too big to understand. But I'm going to simplify it for you because they found out 100,000 genes are in that DNA. So these are a part of DNA. They are called as encoded proteins. They are basically proteins. Now, what they found was they discovered 20,000 protein coding genes which comprises only 1% of the human genome. That means 1% only they identified as useful. 99% they said it is junk. It's of no use in the body. So the junk, the remaining 99% is composed of non-coding DNA. Don't ask me what is coding and non-coding. I don't understand too much of it. As a clinician, I understand they call it as junk. Why I'm bringing that junk now is that junk is the future for understanding. Why there is progesterone resistance? People are removing the junk and checking what is there. I'm going to tell you what. These stretches of DNA in fact have important biological functions which are integral for protein translation. Anything to act, the proteins must translate itself. So this junk thing has been studied now. Interestingly, the DNA is in the nucleus, everybody knows that. RNA is in the cytoplasm. Now the DNA is stored in the nucleus because it is too much, it is too large. That is why the DNA is quite large and the RNA is in the cytoplasm. Now basically what happens is, there is something called as microRNA. In the RNA there is a microRNA. Now that is the junk. The junk, what had been kind of pushed aside, they understood that the microRNAs are there in the junk. Now what is this microRNA? Now that's what is going to change our whole scenario of endometriosis in the next 10 years, hopefully. There are lots and lots of studies have come up by saying there's something called a dysregulation of microRNA. That microRNA should do some job. If it doesn't do the job, it becomes invasive like cancer. And endometriosis like cancer, it invades all over. So that microRNA seems to be the answer. And I'm telling, Acumentis harmonica probably will bring in a new drug, hopefully, and giving them some understanding about endometriosis so that the pharmacology people will kind of make a drug for it. That's what is my wish and many people's wish. Why I got this point was I happen to be in the Ministry of Science and Technology. Even now I'm in the Committee for Women's Health. So I keep going to the meeting and there are a lot of people applying for projects on microRNA. So that made me think about what is this microRNA, because I should be giving my opinion for those projects for the ministry. So I had to really read about it and then understood that this is the future of endometriosis. So once again, the two main types of nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. That's what we're talking about. The DNA provides the code for the cell activities from the nucleus. And the RNA basically converts that code into proteins to carry out cellular functions. So the RNA is necessary for the functioning of that. And the microRNA is something different. Now what is this microRNA? The microRNA is accounting to just about 1 to 5% of human genome. It regulates at least 30% of protein coding genes. That means it controls the protein coding. That's what we know. Now, the microRNAs are the driver of the disease. Endometriosis is all because of alteration of microRNAs, and cancer is because of microRNA alteration. Evidence indicates that microRNA dysregulation is associated with the disease. That means there should be drugs, something to do with that. You should regulate the microRNA. And in cancer, as microRNA can function as oncogenes and tumor suppressors, that means that change can be also seen in endometriosis. So microRNAs are small, non-coding RNAs that collectively represents a novel class of regulators of gene expression. Now specifically, there are so many numbers. I'm not going to talk all about that. You know, microRNA has so many numbers, 9, so many things. Now so they found out some of these are connected to dysregulation. What number? Let's not worry about it. Because the cell cycle progression, endometriosis is all because of proliferation. Proliferation, differentiation, the biologic process regulated by microRNAs, altered expression of target genes. I think that's very interesting to know. The early secretory endometrium from women with endometriosis is characterized by a microRNA expression profile that differs from a healthy endometrium. So I think there should be drugs to stop the dysregulation, and then endometriosis will get the answer. Hopefully. We may not even live to see that, but the young people will be there. They'll remember me for introducing this new subject, and they'll say, 10 years back somebody like Pratap Kumar from Manipal came and spoke about it. Now everybody is giving medicines to remove that microRNA. So now, till then we have no answer. So microRNA are novel physiological regulators of gene expression, and that is interesting to know that. That is why it is all these dysregulation occurs in the deep part of endometriosis. Laparoscopic surgeons would agree with me. One of the tough surgeries is endometriosis. It goes into all kinds of areas and terrible additions, all because of chronic inflammation, and these cells migrate into different kinds of areas. So invasive growth, dysregulated molecules, and the process in endometriosis is the future to understand. Till then we are really going to discuss. So how does it act? Once again, microRNA overexpression could result in downregulation of tumor suppressor genes. That means, whereas microRNA underexpression could lead to oncogene upregulation. So if you find microRNAs are less, they will get cancers and endometriosis and so on. Inappropriate expression of microRNA is strongly associated with tumor-related processes in humans. This is one of the most recent advances what people have found in endometriosis, but that means there's a therapeutic potential. The pharmacologist must find the drug now. Because we are, and the government of India is funding this project of microRNA studies, and people are doing a lot of endometriotic studies in this microRNA level. So that is why I got interested in that. There will be something called antagonists. MicroRNA antagonists will come up in the next few years, and the antagonists were as efficient as glucocorticoids in an animal model for a dust mite allergy. So lots of things are happening on that. So that is what I want to conclude my short talk by saying the magic of microRNA, from regulating genes to aiding disease diagnosis. MicroRNA's impact certainly is being evaluated. So the small molecules may have a big impact. MicroRNAs are small RNA molecules. By binding to and degrading RNA transcripts play a key role in gene regulation. This allows microRNA to silence gene expression, critical in maintaining the biological processes. Abnormal levels of microRNAs have been associated with cancer and also endometriosis. These are the new concepts of endometriosis. With that, in introduction of endometriosis, I would like to once again emphasize the same thing about how things change, like the repetition of that. But we also know the cytokines, growth factors, so many things go wrong. The vascular endothelial growth factor also changes. That's why there's a lot of blood supply happening there. Too much of blood goes into those tissues. That's why prostaglandins are very high. That is why I'm coming to a simple statement. Endometriosis is a very painful condition. We cannot ignore. You know, one of the mother came to me and said, my daughter, every doctor has said nothing is wrong. She must be something wrong with my daughter. I said, no, don't tell that, because then she's telling me when she was young she had pain, so let my daughter also must be having the same kind of a problem. I said, you might have had endometriosis, but you became pregnant and delivered this girl. So this must be endometriosis. I always feel you don't have to prove endometriosis. Why don't you give a therapeutic trial? Because the days are such, we're going to discuss about various kinds of modalities. So I would probably stop with this and call the people for the panel discussion. After introducing you to the new pathology, pathogenesis of endometriosis, let's discuss clinical scenarios of endometriosis. And I would like to call the panel.
Thank you, sir. You really opened a new vista in endometriosis, and now we start the panel discussion. I call upon our panelists, Dr. Manjusha Jindal, she is Associate Professor in Goa Medical College, with teaching postgraduate experience of 22 years. She has been past president of NG Obstetric Gynec Society for 2011, 12 and 2012. She is founder member of Goa chapter of Prenatal Diagnosis and Therapy. Indian Physician Gynecologist since 2009, member editorial board of Indian Obstetrics and Gynecology, member of Academic Council of Goa University, invited to various conferences. She has a chapter on megaloblastic anemia pregnancy, book edited by Dr. Hemant Deshpande, and her special interests are oncology and medical education. Dr. Manjusha, please. Next, Dr. Afzal Siddiqui.
I think I can do without respect. He did his MBBS from Goa Medical College with distinction, MD Goa Medical College with double gold medalist, his fellowship in advanced gynec endoscopy from Mumbai, and PG diploma in minimally invasive and robotic surgery from UK 2013-14. He has been lecturer at Wadia Maternity Hospital attached to KEM from 2010 to 12, and he has been assistant prof at Vinayaka Missions Medical College and Hospital, Pondicherry from 2015 to 17. He is currently visiting consultant and minimally invasive gynecologist at Manipal Hospital, RG Stone Hospital, and Vision Multispeciality Hospital, Mapsa, and he has his clinic at Penjim Multispeciality Clinic, Penjim. Next panelist, Dr. Sachin Narvekar, obstetrician gynecologist and reproductive medicine specialist. He has completed his MBBS and MD from Goa Medical College, following which he underwent specialty training in reproductive medicine at Bangalore Assisted Conception Center. He has published articles in peer-reviewed journals and presented papers at scientific conferences, and currently is practicing at Sunshine IVF Center at Vision Hospital, Mapsa. And Dr. Amit Naik is passed his MBBS in 2002 and MD in 2005 from Goa Medical College. He has fellowship in laparoscopic surgery at Mumbai, practicing consultancy in last 15 years, and is founder and owner of Reticare Hospitals in Ponda. He has keen interest in laparoscopy and fertility management. I would request Dr. Gauri to welcome our panelists with rose each. Rose. I'm going to do later. This panel discussion on do's and don'ts in endometriosis and intrauterine.
Just now, welcome to panel discussion, all of you. As I mentioned just now, endometriosis remains a diagnostic and a therapeutic challenge despite so much of knowledge. And multiple treatment itself tells us we do not know what has to be done sometimes. Let us have some kind of your experience today and to know what is how do you manage these kind of patients. Because we know that, interesting facts in India, almost 1/4 of all diagnosed endometriosis suffering is so much, 5 times that of US and 13 times that of UK. That means India has a large experience with endometriosis, and I'm sure Goa has the same, because we also have a lot of endometriosis. Kerala state has very high endometriosis. We are bordering Kerala state. We get a lot of patients coming from that side also. But we know that it's estimated that at least 26 million Indian women between 18 and 35 are affected in endometriosis, and even beyond that. And I always teach my students, if somebody has these 5 Ds, it is only endometriosis. Dysmenorrhea, dyspareunia, dyschezia, dull aching pain, and disorders of menstruation is nothing but endometriosis. And we also have understood over the years, Madam would agree, that symptoms and signs are never correlating in endometriosis. Somebody may have a large cyst and no symptom, somebody may have a small little lesion and too much of a symptom, and that's what we're going to discuss now. So we also know there are 3 types of endometriosis: ovarian endometrioma, deep infiltrating endometriosis, and adenomyoma is now called as, of course adenomyosis is now called as ADOS, maybe a pet name for adenomyosis. So ADOS is a new terminology. I don't know why they keep changing the names. The Americans and UK, they like to change names, but I still like that adenomyosis, which I've been talking about all the time. And we'll talk about whom to operate, whom not to operate, and whom to give medical management in endometriosis. Now, we'll start with the first question, and anybody can answer. What is the size of an endometriosis one would decide to operate? We'll ask the laparoscopic surgeon, Mohammed. What's the size you would like to take up for a surgery? Do you have some guidelines for that?
For me, the limit is 3 to 4 centimeters. Earlier, the guideline for crane was 4, now we've reduced it to 3. The recent recommendation will be above 4, surgical option should be considered, or above 3 centimeters. Below 3 centimeters, I should first consider.
Louder. Make the mic louder. Thank you. Now he said
3. Anything above 3, you should think of surgical intervention, but also it depends upon patient wishes and the symptomatology. Anything less than 3, you should try medical management with GNL check, agonist, or letrozole. Currently, even cabergoline is being tried, but
when it
definitely.
comes to medical management, so the decision of operation should be around 4 centimeters.
Yes, 3 to 4
Another
centimeters.
scenario. Somebody is coming routinely, we have diagnosed endometriosis without symptoms, and she is not even infertility. She is just a young girl who has come to clinic. Madam, would you like to answer that? She has no symptoms, but ultrasound shows 4 centimeters endometriotic cyst. What would you like to do or not do anything about it?
Yeah, young girl, no symptoms, accidentally diagnosed. I wouldn't want to intervene.
Absolutely.
Unless
correct.
there is a
I think I think being in a medical college, you would be teaching too, and it is important not to operate also in certain of these young girls, especially that they are the adolescent age group. Now, supposing I think I agree with you about that. Now, in the European society has clearly said that 3 centimeters in infertility, there is no evidence of doing cystectomy prior to ART. Somebody has an IVF to do IVF. We can directly do IVF rather than we remove the cyst unnecessarily. In women with endometrioma larger than 3 centimeters, the recommendation is to consider cystectomy prior to ART, but that also is debatable, because I would probably evaluate properly as to do we really need to remove, because we know over the 6 months time there will be recurrence of endometriosis, so we should be very, very careful. I'll ask Amit Naik. Now, do you have, before that I would like to show you my own publication which I have done. Endometriotic cyst removal done meticulously. We analyzed our own data. What we did was we removed the cyst and sent it to the pathologist to find out how much we removed the cortex. So I realized did not show much of significance if you have done well, and that's what I think we need to understand also. And I also published this data in the JHRS journal that laparoscopic cystectomy of endometrioma, good surgical technique, does not adversely affect ovarian reserve, which we will be discussing. So do you think in your institute, what techniques are good in preserving ovarian cyst.
Laparoscopic microsurgical techniques.
Sorry.
Laparoscopic microsurgical techniques, if done properly, means when you're peeling the cyst laparoscopically, if you peel it and see that no cortex is coming along with it or no follicles are coming along with it, that would probably not remove some follicles along with the cyst. Also, if there are any bleeders at the end of the procedure, it might be better to suture the ovary than to cauterize the bleeding points. Again, another very important point is the cyst usually does not feel very well at the hilum. So you have to be very careful over there, because if you pull a little too much, there will be some bleeding over there, and then you might have to cauterize the hilum or suture it, which would decrease the ovarian blood
So
supply.
I'll ask you another supplement question. You hit the nail on the right area, because I too feel the peeling off that hilum area is very difficult. Now, if you have a small cyst and a large cyst, which is easy to remove in your clinical practice?
Unless it is very large, more than 15 centimeters, I think a large cyst will be easier than a very small.
Because I think over the years we realized a smaller cyst is not easy to remove because it's kind of densely adherent. In my department, I always tell small cysts must be operated by seniors, larger cysts can be operated by the juniors, because it's easy to do that. Do you agree with me?
Yes, sir, definitely.
Yeah.
In fact, it is also said that if you give vasopressin, maybe you are able to feel better with saline and vasopressin.
Yeah. So I think you also raised this issue, they also found that AMH goes down in certain people, because the suturing, of course, is never done, and we do not coagulate unnecessarily unless there is a pleader. I think simple technique to compress the tissue is more than enough in endometriotic cystectomy. I think you all agree with me that. Now I'll ask Sachin, since you do a lot of infertility practice also, do you think anti-Mullerian hormone must be checked before surgery?
Yes, we always check anti-Mullerian hormone before surgery, because if the anti-Mullerian hormone is already low, then and if the patient is trying to conceive and she has a cyst, then we should be aware that in this patient the AMH is going to decrease further. Also, medico-legally that is important.
So I think it's agreeable that that anti-Mullerian hormone has to be checked. It's not a must. There's no guideline. Anybody says you should do it. But I think in practice, people are going to sue us tomorrow. I think better to do anti-Mullerian hormone, and the normal value is between 1.5 to 3.5 nanogram per ml. Anything less than 1 is definitely no. But what's the experience? What I found was that you're doing a cystectomy now, and the AMH may go down, but after about 3-4 months, I'm finding it coming back to normal. Did you all experience that situation, or is it my observation only?
Yeah, this is true that AMH falls mostly after 3 months.
So it goes down a little bit temporarily, but it goes back to normal in a good number of cases. But however, you should be very careful in not removing unnecessarily the cystectomies and peeling off all ovarian tissue. There's no doubt about that. Now this we have. Anybody's experience, supposing there are two-sided bilateral cysts.
Bilaterally, it falls more compared to unilateral.
Yes, ma'am.
Bilaterally, if you do bilateral cystectomy, then the AMH falls more compared to the unilateral cystectomy.
Yeah, I think so, because the size of the cyst matters. We discussed a little while ago. The bilateral cyst also matters, because when you remove two-sided cysts, definitely AMH goes down. I had a patient recently. The CA125. Do we do CA125 routinely in endometriosis? No. Anybody, Sachin?
CA125 we don't do routinely.
Yes, it is not recommended. But if you do, you get people who definitely differentiate by blood supply. Endometriosis always has blood supply in the periphery and never in the center. If there's a septa and there's a blood supply in the center, that is malignancy, but not peripheral blood supply. Do you all agree with me?
There is an entity called as atypical endometriotic cyst, wherein there are papillary projections, and that can be malignant. Malignancy in endometriosis is very rare, but we should be aware of that.
Papillary processes, there will be blood supply. If you find blood supply in the by ultrasound inside somewhere, that is suspicious of. I think otherwise there is no role to do CA125, but there is a role to do AMH for sure. So I agree with ma'am that my own study also proved that the size of number does influence the ovarian reserve. especially bilateral and smaller cyst removal is associated with decreased anti-Mullerian hormone, but it is temporary for some time, but it may go back to normal. However, reduction is a must be, we should think about it because we cannot remove everybody's cyst when they come to us. So that means, sorry, what happened? Yeah, we'll ask Sachin, how does one decide whether IVF should be done or ovulation induction should be done after surgery?
Now, when we do the surgery, like my surgeon is Dr. Afzal. So whenever he does the surgery, hello, yeah,
You can hear.
he always gives findings.
Far away.
What are the findings he got during the surgery, and at the end of the surgery, what was the result? So there is a nice index called as endometriosis fertility index that he gives us, by which he can scope the surgery.
It's not clear what you say. Maybe you can keep it little far away.
Yeah, the recent this endometriosis fertility index is a new scoring system which was proposed in 2009, and there are a lot of validated studies on that. So overall, if you want to decide whether we have to what treatment we have to do, if it is a minimal to mild endometriosis, then we can start with IUI, control ovulation stimulation with IUI. Now, after an endometriosis surgery, the best chance for the patient to conceive is in the first 6 to 7 months. And so, whatever treatment we have to do it fast. So, if it is a mild to minimal to mild, we can do a COH with IUI for a few cycles and see.
Yeah, I think you raised the issue correctly now. You discussed it very well because this index which has come up now, endometriotic fertility index is another issue. But I think by looking at the endometriosis, we can make out somebody having a terrible adhesions and stuck, and you have done a wonderful surgery, I know, but sometimes the deep part of the pelvis is frozen. And I think in those kind of patients, there is no place for simple ovulation induction. Do not waste time. You have to do, send them for IVF or do IVF yourself. So I think the indications of IVF will be severity of endometriosis, as we said, completeness of surgery. You may be a very good surgeon, yet you cannot remove everything, and difficulties in during surgery must be thought of. And of course, anti-Mullerian levels itself, lower AMH levels, we should not ignore, we should not waste time and send them for IVF for sure. Now, I'll ask Madam Manjusha, what is the role for the medical management? When is the medical treatment required as the first line, and what are the various drugs you are prescribing in your clinical practice?
As far as the medical treatment is concerned, first line, somebody refuses surgery or is unfit for surgery, I'll put it. Sometimes post-surgery to prevent recurrence.
Yes.
And we have plethora of drugs, starting from, say, today we have progesterone and GnRH, and second line drugs may be danazol and
Yes.
selective.
Yes. You are absolutely correct. The first line of treatment is usually, I always say, endometriosis should be viewed as a chronic disease that requires a lifelong management plan, and the goal of maximizing the use of medical treatment and avoiding repeated surgery. But I think after listening to my discussion about microRNA, which Nimish Pillai missed it, so because you can listen to them, I will tell you how we are going to discuss about microRNA in the next 10 years. So that microRNA, when it comes, I think there will be a new drug. What do you say, Pratik and others
Yes,
from
sir.
Acumentis? You're going to bring some new drugs for us. So now I think when surgery is not possible, I refuse, as Madam said, but I think adolescent age group, you can definitely give medical management. I had one of my medical students, I keep quoting, she was my student. After my endometriosis theory classes, undergraduate, she came and said she already has an endometriotic. She's diagnosed in Delhi, and next week they're going to operate on her. I said, how big is the cyst? She said 3 centimeters. And I said, you're not even married, you're so young. She's only 21 years. And one of my friend in Delhi wanted to operate, but I told her, don't tell I said that, but don't undergo surgery. So I just gave her this Dynogest, and she had so much of painful menstruation. Everybody was planned for surgery. She had taken leave from me to go. Then I think she took that within 3 months, her symptoms was kind of very low with Dynogest. And I said, you continue. And she got into residence in America. She took Dynogest for 2 long years. And the cyst became quite small. My experience is it doesn't disappear, the cyst. What's the experience? It comes down, the cyst, but never disappears. I want to ask all the 4 of you. When you give any medical management, because the most effective right now is Dynogest. So what is the experience of the cyst becoming smaller and the symptoms going away? You can ask, all the 4 can answer.
Very small cysts of prolonged treatment almost can become negligible in size, 2.5 or 3 centimeters. But larger ones, definitely there is a reduction, 20%, 30%, but it never disappears, you rightly said. Yes, Dynogest does have a good effect, but I'll just demonstrate about one case. A lady came with 4 centimeters of endometrioma, was put on Dynogest for 4 months. And 4 months later, we repeated an ultrasound to see the effect. She had right-sided hyponephrosis hydrorata.
Yes.
So I personally feel, and I've always told in all my talks, that an endometrioma is a marker for deep infiltrative disease. If you are managing, yes, conservative line should be offered, medical management should be offered, but you have to monitor. We cannot leave them alone.
Yes.
That has to be done.
I think I agree with you. If there is a hydrouretus, etc., you have to be very careful about that patient. You can take any decision of your choice. But I think we just discussed about it. We can either give oral contraceptive pills like age-old, but I'm going to tell you now how OC pills actually are not very good. You'll be surprised to know that. But of course, the first line is Dynogest, but the second line can be, of course, Danazol, which you don't prescribe anymore because of the androgenicity, and the GnRH agonist. So we are only having 2 things now, the Dynogest and GnRH analog. We'll discuss about it. And basically, what you should know is, how does it act? Do you want to say that? Anybody can answer.
Yeah, Dynogest has, you can say, multiple mechanisms of action. It can be central, it can be local. Central effect is through the inhibition of gonadotropin secretion and producing an ovulation at the end of the day. And the peripheral actions are basically on the endometrium, ovary. So it has anti-proliferative effect, anti-angiogenic effect, anti-inflammatory effect, and also it modulates prostaglandins. So in the end, what happens is that the growth of the endometrial lesion is not there. That's one. And secondly, because hyperplasia is inhibited, so the further, you can say, increase in size is not there. The good part about Dynogest is another one, that the rebound effect is not there. That's another important thing we see in Dynogest.
Yeah, I agree with you, because we were giving oral contraceptive for a long time, but now certain literature has come up by saying how that estrogen in an OC pills, which is even 30 micrograms, is higher than a normal estrogen in the body. So I believe these girls who have taken OC pills for so many years because of endometriosis, they get into deep infiltrating endometriosis later on, because they get activated by the estrogen what they have actually swallowed, which I initially couldn't digest that point. But again, I read about it and I found out that, of course, I'll show you that this article, it's an interesting article here. Isn't endometriosis an estrogen dependent chronic inflammatory disease? The answer is yes. Look at these, we read the blue ones here. Women undergoing controlled ovarian, COC, that the combined oral contraceptive pills for dysmenorrhea may already have developed endometriosis, still undiagnosed as we discussed just now. Women do not respond to COC for primary dysmenorrhea are prone to develop deep infiltrating endometriosis. Means, another article says, the COC may be a rescue factor for regurgitated endometrial glands that would otherwise undergo necrosis, resorption during the physiologically hypoestrogenic menstrual milieu. That means there is a possibility that oral contraceptive pill may have a problem later on, but I think it works out cheaper, and certain of them we can still give OC pill, there's no doubt about that. I had one patient, I have singled out certain complication. I had just given OC pills for just 1 or 2 months. She came with swollen legs. And I said, what happened? And the mother said, there's a familial history of thrombosis. We didn't even ask mother and grandmother's and auntie's history, and we gave her OC pill thinking it is cheaper. And she came with a pure swollen thrombosis of the leg, which maybe once in a way it may happen, but I think we should take history of thrombosis when you prescribe any other guidelines of oral contraceptive pill. So I agree with you that progesterone seems to be the better line of treatment in endometriosis, and we realize that the limitations. What about GnRH analog? You can ask Sachin, the experience of analog.
Yeah, we do prescribe GnRH analogs after surgery to prevent recurrence. And before IVF, there are studies which say that giving GnRH ultra long protocols, they have improved success after with
How
GRT.
long can you give GnRH analog in your practice?
With if you add back therapy, if you give estrogen progesterone, then we can continue beyond 6 months. But usually it's up to 6 months.
What about Manu? How long can we give GnRH analogs? Because we know that osteopenia is one of the problem of GnRH analog, whereas Dynogest doesn't have that osteopenia
To
problem.
be very frank, in our practice, we don't use it more than 3 months.
Yes. Maximum is 6 months, I agree with you. Actually, we got. If I have to do IVF, I may give 3 months, and then I am nowadays giving 3 months of Dynogest also, other than GnRH analog, because it will suppress all little endometriosis all over, and then the success of IVF becomes better. The Royal College has clearly said progestin and endometriosis seems to be the answer for all that kind of problems of endometriosis, and this Dynogest seems to be innovative. You know, I just want to tell you that long back, I always tell this, I hated biochemistry because I never understood anything about it. Those benzene rings never crossed my mind. But even now it doesn't cross. But I think these pharmacologists are very smart. What they did was they took some carbon atom from there and changed it and made it Dynogest. So that's what the Dynogest is. But I want to clarify one point here. Dynogest is a 19 non-testosterone derivative. You know, we are using norethistone acetate for heavy menstrual bleeding. It's very powerful androgenic. So, but this Dynogest also comes from that 19 nor derivative, but it does not have the androgenicity. So I think that is why it is quite powerful in suppressing endometriosis. So what's your experience of, let us ask this question, how does it act? Madam can answer. Okay. How does this Dynogest act? How do they get the relief of symptom?
As I already said that its local effects are there, that is that anti-angiogenic effect which prevents further vascular endothelial growth factor, so you can say new vessels are not formed. It is anti-inflammatory also, so locally that inflammatory processes are not there, all this catalase, metalloproteases and all those things. And also it has anti-proliferative effect.
Yes.
And not only that, it also modulates the prostaglandins. So basically prostaglandin E. So all these local functions, they help Dynogest.
Yeah, I agree with you. Supposing I have given Dynogest and then I operate for some reason, what's the experience of surgery after Dynogest?
There is definitely regression of lesions. It's given for us.
No, do you find it difficult surgery or is it same surgery? You know, when we give GnRH analog and then I operate, I am finding lot of fibrosis. Do you think it's like that?
No, there is definitely difference in the tissue field whenever you're operating after.
Compared to GnRH analog and operation, Dynogest and operation, I agree with you. I think the clarity is much better with Dynogest rather than GnRH analog. Is the experience the same, Amit?
The planes are much better with Dynogest.
Because we resolved many of these things. So I think the Dynogest, the advantages are basically, if you look at this diagram here, there is, we want the progesterone with all these activities, like progesterogenic activity must be there. There should not be glucocorticoid activity. There should not be androgenic activity. There should be anti-androgenic, some of it should be there. And there should not, anti-mineralocortic activity also, we have to be monitoring. But in this Dynogest usually, it has progesterogenic activity, anti-androgenic activity, but none of the others. That's why they don't put on weight, they don't feel heavy, everything seems to be fine. I had another patient, interestingly. She was, very, very rare cases. I had given a talk at Lucknow on something like this, and one of the doctors at the dinner time came and said, her daughter had very strange endometriosis, pleural endometriosis,
Yes.
and she's a medical student in Mumbai, and she gets burst off and on. It just burst in the pleura, and they put a drain and things like that, and they had put on oral contraceptive pills. This is some time back. And I said, no, just put Dynogest. She was so symptomatically asymptomatic and symptomatically much better, and when she stopped it, she did not have for a long time this pleural pain. But after stopping for about 6 months, she again had recurrence. So I told her, you can always start Dynogest, give a gap of 3 months, and then again do another 6 months. Every 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, you can stop it for some time if you feel better, but restart it after 3 months. So then she got into kind of a mood depressions and elevations of maybe the progesterone effect, but I do not know. Very, very strange. And now she's finished her MBBS course and she's still on Dynogest, and I'm feeling proud to say that how helpful it is for certain of these terrible kind of endometriosis. There's no doubt about that.
We've had 2-3 patients, not on Dynogest, but on other progesterone. Normally we see thromboembolism with combined oral contraceptive pills, but 2 of patients have come with cerebral thrombosis, mainly on progesterone. In fact, one of the patients I came to know through my husband. He is a neurosurgeon, and it is with cerebral thrombosis the patient presented.
And what does she take?
Pure progesterone, that is medroxyprogesterone.
Yes, of course. That's why medroxyprogesterone cannot be given for a long time. We can only maybe regularize the cycle for about 3
You had
months.
only taken it for 1 cycle, that also not 1 full cycle.
Okay. But progesterone causing thrombosis is not common.
Yeah,
Estrogen
exactly. And
might
after 3 months, we have had another patient in Goa Medical College itself with pure progesterone. After 2 cycles, she has had thrombosis.
Yeah, maybe because there is a familial thrombosis. If you look at these kind of thrombogenic investigations, probably they are positive in these kind of patients.
Maybe.
We do not know. Anyway, the dose is 2 mg per day we are giving. But what is the comparison as we just discussed about GnRH analog and Dynogest? Anybody can answer this? Sachin, you want to answer this?
There have been studies comparing Dynogest and GnRH, and both are equally effective. But
yeah, they are effective, but what about the side effects, Both are very good, but look at this pelvic pain. The comparison, the pelvic pain with Dynogest is very good compared to GnRH analog. But interestingly, the hot flashes are also not seen with Dynogest. With GnRH analog, I am finding a lot of women come with kind of hot flashes, which is not seen in clinical practice with Dynogest. And finally, of course, bone density, which we have discussed just now. And that's the advantage of all these kind of things. So to conclude the first part of the discussion, we know that select the patient for surgery, avoid unnecessary surgeries, that's what everybody said. And the new molecule of Dynogest seems to be effective in reducing the pain, equally effective like GnRH analog, but there are no side effects like bone loss. Need to give at least 3 to 6 months to see the effect of the drug, and all this we have discussed. Surgery should not be done unnecessarily, and of course, I had another patient, surgery done twice, but by the time she was 20 years. And 20 years unnecessary surgery, that too laparotomy, 2 laparotomies, and then I feel very sad because her ovarian reserve is nothing now. So I think unnecessary surgeries should not be done. We can always give medical enough management and save the situation at least for some time. We'll go to the next part of on the uterine fibroids, which are also a part of problem. Every day we have the same problem. So now, do you think, we're talking about progesterone. So the first question is, everybody knows fibroids here. We'll just talk about few of the important things. Now, do you think progesterone plays a vital role in promoting uterine growth factor? Ma'am, Manjushka, you start about progesterone. Do you think, we always thought estrogen will cause fibroids. But my question is progesterone.
Yes, definitely progesterone plays a vital role. It increases the size of the fibroids. There are various theories behind it. We have seen this during pregnancy also. We always used to wonder probably the estrogen is more, that's why it's growing in size during pregnancy, but now I think we tend to think otherwise. Progesterone
Yeah, absolutely correct, because we are finding that there are progesterone receptors That is why it is causing all this kind of swelling of uterus, and even it grows in the fiber. Of course, estrogen also contributes, I feel, but progesterone receptor seems
What I read recently is estrogen causes upregulation of progesterone receptors.
Estrogen causes
Upregulation of progesterone.
upregulation, maybe. That is why progesterone plays a very vital role in promoting uterine growth, and that is why the drugs like mifepristone has come into clinical practice. So now, we know the progesterone effect on the fibroid, as Madam just now said. Progesterone is believed to be physiological regulators of uterine growth because it expresses so many of these kind of things, and it inhibits apoptosis, increase angiogenesis, and increase fibroid cell proliferation. So can we now understand the action of mifepristone on these? It will be the opposite, isn't it? Sachin, you want to say that?
Mifepristone is an anti-progesterone. It is a selective progesterone receptor modulator, SPRM, and it has a antagonist as well as agonist action, but more of antagonist. So whatever progesterone does, it does opposite of that. So it decreases the proliferation, angiogenesis, and apoptosis. It increases the apoptosis.
Yeah, I agree with you that mechanism are like this. I think the next slide is. Yeah, this has an action. The same thing what we said, the mifepristone is anti-progesterone. It helps in, of course, the opposites of what we said just now, like induces apoptosis. All that is not, decreases angiogenesis and inhibits cell proliferation, and that is why mifepristone is quite good. I had one patient, another patient, she again had severe dysmenorrhea, and again the mother came and said, 3 diagnoses, doctors have seen, ultrasound done 3 times, and there is nothing wrong with her. And when I did the ultrasound, I found 1 centimeter in the cornual area. I was looking for it because we've been taught that cornu is the problem. You know, we've been taught pacemaker in labor. There is no pacemaker, I'm sure, like a heart, but we have been taught pacemakers are in the cornu somewhere in the uterus. That's how the labor starts with that. So I thought, why not suppress that cornual fibroid with mifepristone? And it just disappeared. That 1 centimeter became almost nil, and the dysmenorrhea went off. In fact, somebody said, why not operate? I said, don't operate when we have medical management. So I think where is the situation of fibroid is very important clinically to understand the pain and the dysmenorrhea. Do you agree with the laparoscopic surgeons? We should not operate small little fibroids. But when do we operate then in a clinical practice? If medical management can be given, then when are we going to operate?
Generally, the rule states that if it's a submucous fibroid, unless it's a very small one with minimal symptoms, all submucous fibroids are preferably operated. Intramural fibroid.
No doubt about that. When it's in the cavity, you have to operate. What about the other controversial situations?
So the ones in the myometrium which are very close, that is type 3 fibroids, are better operated. Or if it's outside and it is very large, that the uterus becomes more than 12 weeks.
So that means when the uterus is palpable, do you operate?
It's preferably to be operated.
What about
depending? It also depends. It also asymptomatic fibroids less than 5 centimeters, which are intramural or subserous, I do not operate. If they are 5 to 10, there is no guideline like this, but the recommendation is 5 to 10 depending upon the location and the symptoms. If it's a corneal blocking the tube, I would operate. If they're more than 10, I would definitely offer surgery.
Yes, I think there are a lot of reviews about medicine.
What
Yes,
Dr.
ma'am.
Amit said, that if its uterus is palpable to operate. It will also depend on patient's age, her presenting symptom. Not correct to operate all the
Like in
time.
infertility, do you want to operate? She has no symptom but is palpable per abdomen. Ideally, yes, because it's quite a big one. So I think again there is no guideline as to say what is the size of fibroid, but where is the size fibroid is important to know. Whether corneal, as you said, may be very close to the cavity. Now the thinking is, if the fibroid is very close to the cavity, I'm going to show you that there are some problems with that. Let's discuss that also. And what is the dose to be used and how long in your clinical practice, Sachin? Mifepristone?
Either 10 milligram, it is available as 10 and 25. Yes. I have used for a few patients 10, and there was.
How long have you used? Anybody has used a long time?
6 months.
Yes, I think so, because we do not know the effect after 6 months. Because I have seen one problem, endometrial hyperplasia. Who has seen that? Have you seen after 6 months? Or I have seen patients coming to me, no symptoms, but I do the ultrasound, there's very thick endometrium. Anybody has seen this problem?
So I've seen that, but patient taking mifepristone not for gynecological reasons, taking for neurosurgical reasons and adrenal reasons. They take high dose of mifepristone for longer times,
Yes.
sometimes even 2 years. Definitely there is endometrial hyperplasia. But in 6 months I have not seen. Tickling, yes, but not hyperplasia.
Agree with you, because I have found few patients, maybe less than 10% of my cases come with endometrial hyperplasia, and I initially was getting worried. Is it going to get cancer? So I started doing biopsy in these patients, and nothing was wrong. All showed proliferative endometrium. So if you find a thick endometrium after 6 months, in a small number, you may have to stop the treatment because there is something going wrong. It may not be following whatever we've been discussing just now. So we know that all the studies have proved that 25 milligrams seems to be effective. 10 milligram is also okay, but if she doesn't respond well, I'm using 25 milligram per day for a myoma. So what's the comparison of mifepristone and GnRH analog? It's the same story, isn't it, madam?
Same story. What is with Dymagest and GnRH? Same story here. That as far as their effectivity is equal, but the big advantage, there is no rebound effect with mifepristone, and the side effects of leuprolide are not there.
Because they have found very clearly compared to leuprolide and mifepristone, 40% decrease of uterine artery blood flow with the mifepristone, while only 20% with leuprolide, and there is no significant change in the liver enzymes and all that with this kind of a drug, because we know the other drug, ulipristal, may be having some effect on the liver, but we are not sure about it. Because they are saying it can be given. So the conclusion of that study was, you can give 25 milligram without any problems of leuprolide like bone loss and so on. So 25 milligram seems to be the answer. So safety of mifepristone in uterine fibroid patients. Have you seen endometrial hyperplasia? I have also answered that question, because I have seen, none of you have seen, I suppose, but I've been giving for 6 months. And
I have
you've seen, ma'am?
Then I decided to
Stop.
give a surgical management because I saw the hyperplasia. I have used mifepristone for many patients.
Very good. That means you are seeing endometrial hyperplasia in a certain number, small number of patients, but I'm talking about somebody who's come like adolescent age group. Then don't go and operate on them. I think we're very careful with adolescent. Unnecessary surgery should not be done.
Actually, what I read recently was that this endometrial hyperplasia is quite benign. It doesn't progress to atypia. And the pathologists call it as a progesterone modulator associated endometrial changes. PACE.
What is it? It's a new word for me.
PAEC.
Progesterone
modulator associated endometrial changes. These are quite benign, they say, and they are reversible.
PAEC.
PAEC.
It's like a pace. Goa.
Yeah, I just like to say that it's absolutely right. PAEC is for short term therapy with mifepristone is usually benign. Endometrial on ultrasound, endometrial thickening may be often found, but not necessarily endometrial hyperplasia on a pipal biopsy. But for patients whom we are putting for a long term for other reasons, maybe adrenal or neurosurgical, yes, there have been cases of endometrial hyperplasia with atypia, and then which have been irreversible, and patient has been advised a major gynecological surgery after that.
I agree with you 100%, because this article also says that I verified many articles. There is no atypical hyperplasia is noted. They didn't find all the kind of atypism. So repeated endometrial histopathology did not reveal any complex hyperplasia or atypism either with 10 milligram or 25 milligram in Indian women with uterine fibroid. Endometrial biopsy showed no pre-malignant changes, and of course no risk of bone marrow problems, etc. That's an interesting point, because I was getting initially worried, why should they get endometrial hyperplasia? And as madam said, we are seeing it in a small number, but we know that things are not too bad with that. So advantages of low dose mifepristone, as we discussed just now, is as effective as GnRH analog, no effect on the bone marrow loss, less side effects, oral route administration with good compliance, allows time for correction of anemia and plan the surgery sometimes. Menses reverted, as madam comes back to very fast when you stop it. There is no prolonged antagonist area effect there. and improves health-related quality of life for sure. So what are the effects of different types of, this is what we're discussing. Effects of fibroid on fertility, let's ask. Anybody can answer. Sachin, you want to start with that? Does the size, height, number change? You spoke about that, I think.
The submucous type 0 and type 1, they definitely affect fertility. Whereas the intramural subserous fibroids, unless they are very large, we don't have to worry about them. But intramural fibroid is controversial. We have to individualize the case. Whether
I agree with you. I think that paragraph says clearly, current literature calls for removal of submucous fibroid, there is no doubt about that, and possibly cavity distorting intramural fibroids as you mentioned. However, removal of a non-cavitary distorting fibroid is still controversial. But I think you raised a point just now. Did you raise it, Amit Naik? One of you said that the FIGO classification. All of you, the postgraduates must definitely know. If I am an examiner, I'll come and ask these kind of things. so FIGO classification of fibroids is important because we made a routine now when you do ultrasound, we'll say FIGO number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because see everybody knows 1, 2 is coming in the cavity, but look at the 3 and 4. The 3 and 4, there's a difference. The 3 is very close to the cavity and the 4 is not in the cavity. But 3 and 4, very close to the cavity, also matters for IVF. People understand. The Sachin will tell us why, because why is it harmful?
It can induce myometrial contractions and the junctional zone which
is because when we put an embryo transfer, we want success. That is service 40 to 60% only successful. And when there's a small little fibroid there, success goes down. Because the junctional zone is the innermost layer that immediately abuts the endometrium in the zone, may affect fertility by two different reasons. Number one, origin of myometrial peristalsis is a new thought, and of course that's how disruption occurs. It may also cause thickening or disruption of the junctional zone, leads to poor outcome of pregnancy. That's another new thought. So what I look at another diagram I have drawn for you all. There are two, that they found out this myometrial, I don't know how they do it, but by ultrasound we can never pick up all this. What they did was, they did CMRI, C means cine, like a cinema. CMRI, they did some lot of studies and they found out that those cavities like this, cavities is not distorted, but look at that. This is very close to the cavity compared to this, and they found there are two types of myometrial peristalsis. Number one, first is local or sporadic bulging of the myometrium. That is sometimes when you do ultrasound you find a bulge, you think it's adenomyoma. It's not, it's a contraction. The second is the rhythmic and subtle stripping movement in the subendometrial myometrial cause, which causes high frequency. That is why a fibroid in pregnancy, we know she'll get into preterm labors. They'll get red degeneration, which we have been talking for years together. But why do they get into preterm labor? Because they get into contractions. That is why a fibroid complicating pregnancy, men cannot be treated as low risk. They are all high risk. You may have to give them progesterone so that there is no myometrial contractions, and you look at the cervix all the time in fibroid complicating pregnancy, because we have now found in IVF centers will realize, okay, I did a small little different thing in my clinical practice. If I found something like this, I don't operate, but I'll give mifepristone for about 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and that may shrink, and that will go away from the cavity. And then I do my IVF and embryo transfer, and I'm finding a very new, no book tells this. This is out of the box thinking, I say. I always feel you should think something different. So there's a role for giving mifepristone for a small little one before embryo transfer, and then your embryo transfer hopefully becomes better. No proof of anywhere, no guidelines, but this is just my thought. So small intramural fibroids of type 3 and type 4 probably affect fertility, decreases pregnancy rate, and of course live birth rate also. It is difficult to decide which patients with small intramural fibroid will benefit by surgery or no surgery. And if you look at that carefully, where is it in the cavity, I think that matters a lot. To summarize what we discussed once again, of course I didn't answer one question. When you do myomectomy laparoscopically or laparotomy, how do we suture? Microsurgical principles, are you following? No. We have been teaching for ages. Put minimum incisions. That's a standard postgraduate question.
Definitely. In a lady who's desirous of childbearing in future, meticulous surgical technique is an absolute must. If the endometrial cavity is open, please close the suture. Please close the endometrial cavity. Do not leave it to its own with absorbable suture. Multiple layers of suturing. The serosal always with inverted baseball suturing, and then an adhesion barrier on top, leaving minimal open space or minimal dead space there for a hematoma.
So how do you know that that space has been closed?
So the first suture that you take, depending on how big the fibroid is, you may first take a figure of 8 or use suture to obliterate the dead space and then close in layers. So first close the deepest layer and then come in layers. Do not restrict yourself to 2 or 3. As many layers as it takes to close the dead space.
I think it's the same principle as laparotomy.
Absolutely.
Now everything is taken over by, but we are still doing laparotomies for some patients. And I'll teach my postgraduates. You take from below and then go up, as I said. But one clinical point which many people don't tell is, how do you really know you have sutured well? Everything looks fine. I always tell, press the uterus. Press the uterus. If there's a collection of blood, it will come out from the suture lines. If it doesn't come out, means you've done a good job of suturing. Do you agree, madam? In your clinical practice, during OT, we always tell, press and see. If nothing comes out, means you sutured well. If the collection comes out, means you resuture it. That's it. So to conclude our discussion with panelists, effective medical treatment for women with bulk symptoms, mifepristone seems to be acting, but you must choose which patient to give and which patient you should not give. Non-surgical techniques are not suitable for those patients who wish to conceive. One needs to carefully choose the type of management depending on the fertility issue or not. So thank you very much for your discussions and greetings from Manipal.
Thank you, sir, and thank you all the panelists. There are a lot of take-home messages. Please don't move. There are a lot of take-home messages. I would request Madam Anjali to give a memento to our speaker and the panelists. Our guest speaker first. Sorry, Madam, to trouble you. Attendance register is on this table. Those who are not signed, please sign the attendance. How are you?
And then the full clinical management he has discussed in the form of panel discussion. In this way, I think the audience attention was good.
And I think most of the issues actually were discussed threadbare, so that's why the audience does not have much questions. But in case anybody has any doubts or any queries.
Have you used any other medical treatment rather than Dynoges like letrozole or bromocriptine?
Yes, of course. Dynoges is the first choice always. But I've also used letrozole, 2.5 milligram once a day, continuously for 3 months. Some of them are resistant to Dynoges. You can't say every case will be fine. There will be small percentage of women who do not respond. And I've used this letrozole for some time, 6 months, but because of anti-histogenic, they get sometimes little effect of less estrogen also. That's also good. Also bromocriptine can be also given, but it's also a lot of side effects are there in that. But ultimately, comparatively, compared to all that, Dynoges seems to be the best.
And there have been recent interest in vaginal tenazole. And also I have read about vaginal mifepristone. So yes, it was my I was reading that. So they say that vaginal has a lower systemic side effect.
I have no experience because sometimes my patients don't like anything to go through that area because they feel irritation, I don't know, they get burning sensation. So I don't know whether you can try and see how it works. But many times when I even give some simple pessaries for progesterone pessaries I give for preventing preterm labors, they have some burning sensation and so on. Maybe the weather is, like of course, Goa and weather now, same. So I'm not sure. I have no experience. Do you think vaginal progesterone can be given?
It can be, sir. We need to find out more studies.
I had a question. When we are doing a myomectomy, a laparoscopic myomectomy, is it very important to suture the endometrial cavity?
No, not necessary.
Because when we are doing a hysteroscopic myomectomy, we are not suturing any endometrium. There is a huge defect in fact.
No need.
And if
Because
you take a
in fact
proper
in our old traditional teaching is if you open the cavity, then no need to suture. Just
it drains also.
Suture the muscle over there.
It drains also better from
Suture
down.
inside the cavity, there will be additions. And there will be some kind of focal addition seen.
The endometrium is much better after the surgery if you know.
Just leave it like that.
Yeah,
It
up
is
on
easy.
an ultrasound.
I read a few guidelines, I think somewhere in the treatment of endometriosis, rather adenomyoma, if you are doing an excision, that's the time you should suture the cavity using a triple flap method.
I think adenomyosis is a very different issue by itself. I didn't discuss about that. You want to say anything on that? Yeah, maybe you can choose because adenomyosis itself is a very hard tissue.
Yeah.
So probably, I don't know. Generally, we avoid suturing the endometrium so that there is.
Actually, one of the recommendations is not endometrium, actually subendometrial sutures with PDS or very absorbable sutures to bring the endometrium together. That's one of the recommendations for better outcome of the laparoscopic myomectomy. It's not a must, as you say, with a small fiber and very small gland, the endometrium is going to heal. But if it is a larger end, to bring the endometrium in good apposition, it's one of the recommendations to use an absorbable suture in the subendometrium. But yeah.
Okay. Always above the endometrium.
Yeah, it means it's better avoided for.
Well, I had one patient operated twice myomectomy elsewhere, and she came with actually hypomenorrhea. She was having menorrhagia before. Then after this, no menstruation. So I did a ultrasound. I didn't find the cavity well. So I put a hysteroscope, complete additions all over. Actually, it's like Asherman's. I had to cut that and put, give an estrogen, progesterone, build up endometrium. But I was feeling sad because endometrium is completely gone. And I'm not able to do anything for her now because she now just wants to get that menstruation correctly. And I'm giving estrogen and progesterone to increase the endometrium. I think as a myomectomy, whether it's laparotomy or laparoscopy, please be careful. Endometrium should not be sutured. Unnecessary. You can suture a little bit, but not deep sutures going all over the cavity and then causing additions.
I didn't mean to go into.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you totally. Because the states which come to me, I saw myself. They sutured the cavity.
Definitely not the cavity.
Sir,
I had
the experience of digestive adenomyosis.
Yeah, it doesn't really work so well like the other kind of endometriosis because we know over the years adenomyosis is a totally different ball game by itself. Though we call it as internal endometriosis, it is a separate entity by itself. The resistance is higher than endometriosis, external endometriosis. It doesn't work well. I would put a Mirena inside if there's adenomyosis for some time, not for young girls. Somebody to avoid a hysterectomy, I may give Mirena later on. But for young adenomyosis, is GnRH analog. GnRH analog is very effective than the analgesic in adenomyosis.
How do you manage a patient who is about 45-year-old with a 6 centimeters endometrium and she's asymptomatic?
In fact, that's an interesting question because if there are no symptoms, why operate? Why do anything? She's fine. She may reach menopause, then it will regress. If there are no symptoms, don't touch it. Because if you do unnecessary test, aspirate that and do some CA-125, you'll be unnecessarily interfering. If there are no symptoms at that 45, 43 years, is it? I don't think you should anything. What about you?
Yeah, you should.
No, I think less interference is better than, yes.
If you have a girl who is 25 years old, not married, and she has a cyst endometrium of about 6
centimeters. So, I would not do anything because I know endometriosis, if you take it now, it will recur in 6 months, and I would just wait and no medical management at all, not surgical management because she has no symptoms. And if she gets married, then you will consider. Before marriage, I think you have to wait because by the time she finds a husband, she'll have another recurrence.
I had a patient similar to what Dr. Sachin is talking. She came to me at the age of 16 years. I still remember her name, and she had a big endometrioma, about 10 centimeters in size. We operated laparoscopically. She got married early.
Okay.
That was the good part. She had 2 children. And in between 2 pregnancies, she again came with dysmenorrhea. We told her, complete your family. And after the second child, she came with bilateral endometriomas and endometriosis all over the peritoneum.
I think so. I think advice like as a surgeon and a physician, we know they should get married early. I think if they're not married and it's asymptomatic, just wait for some time.
That is irrespective of the size.
So if it's palpable for abdomen, it may rupture sometime. No? So I think depending on the size. Because I have also seen rupture. In fact, endometrium I saw in pregnancy.
I have seen my
Rupture
case
in
of
pregnancy. Everybody said it is appendicitis. I said no, because I have operated on this patient. She became pregnant, but when during pregnancy I found another cyst. And the general thinking is that endometriosis will go down in pregnancy. But she came in sudden acute abdomen, and everybody said appendicitis. Over the phone I said, no, this is rupture of endometriosis. You can still call the surgeons and look at the appendix. But I had proved myself correct by saying endometriosis can rupture. With a larger palpable mass, I think we have to remove.
Traditionally, like we had learned when I was doing a PG, like a uterus which is about more than 12 weeks size with a fibroid, we should remove it. But now that has changed. Like even if there is a big myoma up to 14 weeks and patient is totally asymptomatic, then we don't have to touch it.
Yeah. In that case, I think look at the kidneys and pelvis. There's some dilatation of all those kind. I think you may have to operate. I think individually you have to change your decision. There is no hard and fast rule. You agree, sir? Nothing is hard and fast rule. Every patient you have to decide each individual.
So in a young adolescent girl whom we see with dysmenorrhea in the OPD, which is progressively increasing dysmenorrhea, with the ultrasound not showing any changes in the ovaries, what would be your threshold to start her on Dynogest? Threshold, would you start or
Of course, just come to you with symptoms.
Yeah, and age, so is there any age threshold that we consider?
No, we can start with anybody because she has pain. As I said, don't wait for 7 long years to diagnose. That's what that patient, I said plenary session. One girl came and spoke only about herself, 45 minutes about her pain. I think the present day, you don't have to prove it is endometriosis. It's the only condition, there is no need to prove. You just start as a therapeutic trial of Dynogest. In 3 months, you'll be much better. Because there will be a little small thing on the uterosacral ligament which you can't pick up. And that will be on that nerve, that one nerve passes through that canal. So that ureteric canal, there can be nerve supply which can go wrong. That one single nerve will be painful.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
No more questions. Thank you. We conclude the panel discussion. Coming to the administrative issues which I want to discuss is, one thing is what happens is basically we are representing as president of POGS or sometimes my secretary, we represent you on various bodies of the government. And there we come across various things. So I want to bring to your notice certain things, and we cannot, in no way we are ready to defend you in case some laws are broken or some rules of the land are not taken into consideration. So few things. Number one, whenever there is maternal mortality of patient under your care, you are expected to report it to the immediate health officer of your area immediately within 20